Amen. Um, okay, so this is our third week of looking at Daniel. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Daniel. We're just going to kind of be in and out different chapters because our word for today is respond. So we've talked about prepare and we've talked about resolve. And so this week we're talking about respond. So just kind of make sure we are recording. Yeah. Okay. And some of you will recognize I'm kind of going back to the old wording, excuse me, because Daniel responded with several holy no's. And so we've talked about what a holy no is, and that no is as holy an answer as yes. But sometimes saying no is scary. And some of us don't say no very well. And when we don't say no very well, we can find ourselves in situations that are sticky. They're not where we wanted us to be. And we can become even overwhelmed and mad at ourselves because we didn't just say no. Anybody relate to that? So we're going to be looking at several examples of what kind of no Daniel gave. And the first one is that he said no to people pleasing. He said no to people pleasing. And we see this right in the very beginning with Daniel 1:8, when Daniel, and we talked about this last time, he resolves not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. So it would have pleased the king. It would have pleased the guard, and it might have pleased him even to say yes. But he said no to trying to please other people because he was more interested in pleasing God. And that's the whole key to that piece. But as I was thinking about it, the royal food and wine was probably amazing. It was better than most of the Jews had eaten in a really long time, because before they were taken to Babylon, remember, Jerusalem had been under siege. And when one country puts another country under siege, they cut off the water supplies, the food supplies. They basically try to starve people into submission in a lot of ways. And that's where a lot of the Jews were. And if you look at Lamentations 2:11, Jeremiah was recording some of that. And he says, "My eyes fail from weeping." He's looking at Jerusalem. "I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because infants and children faint in the streets of the city due to lack of food." In fact, there were even reports it's either in Isaiah or further on in Lamentations, where parents were accused of eating their own children because they were starving. So that's the situation. Daniel goes into the new palace or wherever it is that he's living, and he's presented with all this amazing food. I mean, just think about what it might have smelled like and looked like and how hungry they probably were. And he chooses to eat water and vegetables because he knew that the royal food had been sacrificed to idols, and it was not kosher. He couldn't eat it. So it's one thing to say, "Oh, Daniel resolved not to eat." No, think about how hard that no must have been to his flesh to say no to that. And he might have justified it to himself. He could have said things like, "Well, I need to get my strength back, and this food's going to help me get my strength back." Or, "Hey, it's free. Who am I to turn down a free lunch? I deserve this good food. I'm nearly starving to death." Or he could say, "Others would kill to have this opportunity. Who am I to pass up this opportunity when my fellow men are starving in the streets?" So there's lots of things Daniel could have said to himself to justify eating the food, but with faith, he kept to his convictions, and he said no. He had this like laser focus. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what God has said, and I'm going to obey. And so he didn't let himself get distracted from his obedience to God. He didn't let himself get distracted by his obedience to God. And he said no to pleasing other people, including himself. So the first no is no to people pleasing. And be sure if you're writing that down, that includes ourselves. Because sometimes we're the first person that we're trying to please. A lot of times we're trying to please other people, but honestly, sometimes we're just trying to please ourselves. So he said no to people pleasing. The second no, holy no, was he said no to fear. And this is a big one. And this is a lot that's going on right now, too, is a lot of fear. But Daniel said no to fear. So let's look at what that really looked like. And I want us to think, because, a lot of times we read these stories and it just sounds like, a narrator's telling you this crazy stuff. But if you really stop and think about the context and the situation and the feelings that might have gone on in that situation, it can help you get a little bit more out of the story. So we're going to read in Daniel 2, verse 12 through 16. And we've read this before. This is the story of when King Nebuchadnezzar had a nightmare, he had a dream, and he didn't only want someone to interpret it, he wanted to test them by making them tell him what his dream was. And he calls in all of his astrologers and everybody, and they're like, nobody can do this. So in verse 12, it says, this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. Okay, sit there for a second. What would you do if you found out that someone had been sent to kill you? Think of the initial terror, and what would your gut response be? What would your fight or flight be? What am I going to do? Someone's on their way to kill me. And then in verse 14, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone to put to death the wise men of Babylon, when the guy shows up to kill him, Daniel talks to him. Now just imagine that, guys. Someone's coming to your door to kill you. Daniel asks a question, and we've talked about this. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Then he explained the matter to Daniel. At this, then Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Okay, those words don't begin to tell us what that was probably like. The man who's sent to kill Daniel shows up at the door, and Daniel asks, why is this happening? And then when he finds out, he goes around that man and goes to the man who issued the decree. Can you imagine going to the person who ordered your death? I mean, yes, he talked to him with wisdom and tact, but let's sit on the fact that that was not easy. Daniel was probably, he could have just been frightened to death. So how was he able to respond with wisdom and tact? In verse 14, it says that Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. And then he went into the king and he asked for permission to interpret the dream for him. So that's all well and good, but Daniel had to get to a point where he knew that his life was entirely in God's hands. Period. And we know that from Daniel 1, we know that he fully believes that the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Babylonians. He knew this was coming. He heard it from Jeremiah. So he knew that God took him from Jerusalem to Babylon. He knew that God had placed him in the position where he was with the king. And he must have thought, well, if God's going to remove me at this point, if God's going to remove my life at this point, that is his prerogative as well. It's just a complete life of surrender to the point of, if it's time for my death, it is time for my death. Daniel was so surrendered to God that he could respond in this way because his life was not his own. And it makes me think of that verse, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And, you can wear that on a t-shirt all you want, but when it comes down to it, do we really live that way? To live is Christ. That's great. But to die would even be better. Can we really live that out? But Daniel showed that he believed his life was entirely in God's hands. And he modeled that for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He did that in Daniel 1 when he was not going to eat the food. And then he did it in Daniel 2 because he went to them and he asked them to pray for him because he was going to try to interpret the dream. So they were there watching Daniel respond to all of this as well. And their lives were on the line. So when they get to their own story in Daniel 3, they know how to respond as well. So let's look at Daniel 3, verse 16 through 18. And just to recap this story, this is, which I think is really interesting. So Daniel interpreted the dream that there was this very large statue, awesome in appearance, and the head was made of pure gold. And Nebuchadnezzar kind of took that literally because then he built a huge statue of gold. Basically said, well, that's the dream. I'll make a real statue. And he wanted everyone to bow down to it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't. So he gets really mad about it. So in verse 16, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him when the king is furious. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from his majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. They had the same thing. Their lives in chapter 3, their lives were in danger. I mean, in chapter 2, their lives were in danger. And in chapter 3, their lives are in danger again. And I think because Daniel modeled that surrender, these other guys were able to live a completely surrendered life as well. So his holy no impacted other people. And sometimes, it just takes one person to say no, and then others are encouraged and they can follow as well. But just like it takes one person to say no, sometimes it takes one person, especially a leader, to compromise. And then that just leads a whole bunch of other people down the road of compromise as well. So right now, fear is, there's just so many people who are afraid. They're afraid of COVID. They're afraid of immigrants. They're afraid of money. They're afraid of inflation. They're afraid of China. They're afraid of it. I mean, there are so many people afraid. And what a great time for God's people to not be afraid, to live in that place of, we're going to say no to fear. Because we have to ask ourselves, do we really, really believe that we are in God's hands? And do we really believe that God is in charge, that he is sovereign, that he's not just watching what's happening and saying, well, I'll work it out eventually. He is in charge. And if we really believe that, then we can say no to fear. Now, do we do stupid stuff? No. Do we pay attention to what's going on around us? Yes. But in the middle of that, we can live with confidence and not fear. All right, so no to people pleasing, say no to fear. And the third no is say a holy no to compromise. So in chapter 4, find chapter 4 of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. This man is an active dreamer. And this time, however, he shares his dream with Daniel, and then he asks him to interpret it. And in this dream, I won't read the sake of time, but in this dream, there's this very big tree, and the whole world is under it, and it's very strong. And animals look to it, and people look to it. And Daniel tells him that tree is you. However, at at some point, the tree is cut down and it is just left to be a stump. And a voice says, let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times passed by for him. Basically, the dream is about Nebuchadnezzar and what's going to happen to him. So Daniel has a choice right here. He knows what the dream means. God gives him what the dream means. And we learn in verse 19 of chapter 4, it says, then Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, that's what he called him, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. So right in there, he was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. It was not immediate. He was hesitating. He did not want to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was, because it was not good. And Daniel knows that King Nebuchadnezzar is a ruthless man. He also cares for him at this point, and we find that out. But Daniel could have compromised right here and just said, oh, the dream's about somebody else. Don't you worry about it. Oh, the dream is about your enemy. Or, oh, the dream is, he could have misinterpreted it in order to make the king happy with him, because he had no idea how the king was going to respond. But Daniel said no to that compromising, and he chose to tell the truth. And a lot of times that's where compromise comes in, between a lie and a truth. So Daniel chooses not to compromise. And he actually shows that he cares for the king when he says, oh, my Lord, in verse 19 still, my Lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. So he really doesn't want this to be true of Nebuchadnezzar. But he basically has to tell the king that he's going to lose his throne for a while, and he's going to be homeless, and he's going to go mad, and he's going to drink the dew off the grass and eat the grass like an ox. He is going to be a crazy person for a time. And it said for 7 times, 7 times. And we don't know, I don't know, 7 times is 7 weeks, 7 months. I wouldn't think it would be 7 years, because by then they would have replaced the king. But for some period of 7 times, the king was going to be mad, running around in the countryside like a crazy person. But Daniel said no to compromising on that truth. He also then turns, if you jump over to chapter 5, he has another opportunity where he can compromise. So first, he doesn't compromise with Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells him the truth. You're going to go mad for a period of time, basically until you come to terms with the fact that God is God. And once you do that, you will be restored. Now, in chapter 5, King Nebuchadnezzar is gone, and it's set, and King Belshazzar, which is actually not necessarily his son, but he is in the family line of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar is a really bad king. Nebuchadnezzar was bad. He was evil. He was ruthless. But he also had kind of a good side. There were times when he totally recognized the God of Abraham, and he worshiped him. But in chapter 5, King Belshazzar, he did not do any of that. And so you remember that King Nebuchadnezzar stole the items from the temple in Jerusalem, and he brought them to Babylon, and he put them in the temple of his gods. Well, King Belshazzar remembered that, and he had to go one worse. And so he's having a party one night, and he says, hey, go get those silver goblets, bring them to my party. And then he, his wife, his nobles, and his concubines drink from the goblets that were to be used for the sacrifice. And not only that, but while they're drinking from them, they praise the God of gold and silver and iron. They praise not non-real gods, idols, while they're drinking of the goblets that came from the Holy of Holies in the temple of God. I mean, they might have just thrown pig guts on all of them. They were basically desecrating God's elements there. And this is where, have you ever heard that phrase, the writing on the wall? It comes from this story. So they're having this wild party, and suddenly a hand appears hanging in the air, and it writes on the wall. Have you ever heard that, Jacob? Have you ever read this story? Yeah. So just imagine this hand appearing. I mean, it's like a Halloween thing, right? This hand appears in the air and it writes on the wall, and they don't know what it says. I mean, they're all freaking out because there's a hand in the middle of the air. I mean, God does what God wants to do. Anyway, so the queen remembers that Daniel had solved some problems from Nebuchadnezzar. So she says, call that Daniel guy and let him tell us what this writing means, because it was in a language they didn't understand. And Daniel comes in, and I love this because let's kind of get into the feeling of what's going on. So in chapter 5, verses 5-8, it says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners, and he said to the wise men, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And now, of course, all the wise men come in, but they can't tell him what it means. But Daniel comes in, and at this moment, he too could compromise, and he could lie to King Belshazzar. He could be nice to King Belshazzar and try to appease him. But Daniel comes in this moment, and I love it. He just starts right off the bat telling the truth. And he basically reads King Belshazzar the riot act, like he never did for Nebuchadnezzar. So let's look in verse 18. It says, your majesty, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed of a royal throne and stripped of his glory. And it tells the story of when he went out to be a crazy person. Verse 22, but you, Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank from them. You praised the God of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent that hand that wrote the inscription, and this is what it was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. No one knows. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Just think of these words crashing down on Belshazzar's mind. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That's basically your enemies. Are coming to take everything. And then verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. The Medes and the Persians were already on their way. Darius was already on his way. Now, Daniel could have compromised. He could have lied and justified it, but he told the truth. So he said a holy no to compromise there. And if He basically gave God's words to Belshazzar there, telling him how he was a failure as a king. Now, we can also see that in Daniel 3:12. Again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to do the same thing. They have to choose not to compromise. They are supposed to bow down to that golden idol, and they don't. And they could have compromised right there. And they could have said, well, what good are we dead? How can we set an example for God's people if we're dead? I won't bow down in my heart. I can just bow down on my knees, but in my mind, I won't be bowing down. But they chose not to compromise, and they did not bow down to the golden image. Saying a holy no is not popular. It can make people really mad at us. It can make us feel really alone. But in order to obey God, we have to say a holy no. So he responded with a no to people pleasing, no to fear, no to compromise. And the last one is a no to, it's kind of a combo. Fear and compromise are in there too, but also retaliation. And as we talk about this, I want you to think about just our culture and how big retaliation is right now. And what a temptation it can be for us. So let's look in Daniel 6. This is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So basically, Daniel was appointed above all these other, once Darius came to rule, Daniel was appointed above like 120 other satraps and other administrators. He was in charge of them. And it says, so that the king might not suffer loss. So basically, he was to keep the other people from cheating the king. And they were trying to. And Daniel wouldn't let them. He didn't let it go through. So if you remember back in chapter 1, Daniel was chosen because he was as one who was qualified to serve in the king's palace, right? And we talked about how that meant that he had integrity. This is where that's coming into play. And, sometimes when people are trying to be dishonest and cheat and get something for their own gain, the last thing they want is a person of integrity hanging around. So they tried to find some way that Daniel would not be a man of integrity. And it says they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. So they couldn't find anything wrong with Daniel as far as the job that he was doing or his character. But he's keeping them from cheating the king. Either that or he knows they're cheating the king and he can expose them. So the only thing they can do is find a way to have some part of his faith cause him a problem. So, and it says, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. That's verse 5. So in verse 6, it says, so the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den." Now, it's interesting, as you read several times, every time these guys go to the king, they go as a group. Because they're trying to use numbers to apply pressure. And that happens a lot. And going up against numbers can be very intimidating. But they basically bully the king. And they also, by saying everybody who's wise in this whole kingdom thinks this is a good idea, that's implying that if the king doesn't agree, he's stupid. So they basically bully the king into this decision. So let's look at verse 10. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Then these men went in as a group again and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So Daniel did three things. He went home, he prayed as he had done before, and he thanked God, and he asked God for help. He went home, he prayed as he had done before, he went back to his regular spiritual practices, and he asked God for help. Now, think about what his response could have been. I mean, what would you do? He could have run away again. He could have gotten to this point and said, again, God, this is too much. I have obeyed you here, 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 and here, and here, but I'm tired of these people coming after me. I'm done. He could have also argued that he'd been set up, which he had. But Daniel knew the laws of Babylon, and he knew that the king had to obey his own decree. So turning to the king wasn't going to do him any good, as we find out later. He knew his only hope was God. So he went to the Lord. So Daniel says no to compromise because his worship is for God alone. He says no to fear here again because he could have run away or he could have tried to kill the men who were coming looking for him. But he also says no to retaliation because he doesn't point out what the others have done to cheat the king. Because he knows it's still not going to change the fact that he worshiped God during that 30-day period. And he knew the king had to follow his own law. Now, I thought it was interesting that the decree only said that he had to be thrown in the lion's den. It didn't say he had to be killed in the lion's den. So when Daniel is in the lion's den and he's not killed because the lions won't eat him, then the king can pull him back out because he did what he was supposed to do. I just thought that was a little cool thing. Okay, so Daniel said no to people pleasing, no to fear, no to compromise, and no to retaliation. Now, if you think about it, all of those things are how culture responds in situations. But God's people are called to respond differently. So that doesn't mean we never try to please other people, because that's okay, but not when it's other people or God. Doesn't mean that we're never going to feel afraid, but we choose not to give in to that fear. And the Bible's full of verses about do not fear, do not be afraid. Joshua 1:9 is one. We say no to compromise, and not the good kind of compromise, because if you're in a relationship, you know sometimes it's all about compromise. But no to that kind of compromise that makes us choose something else over God's way. And nobody, even the closest person to you ever, should not ask you to compromise anything in your relationship with God. And then we say no to retaliation. And this one can be really hard. And this is a big one because there's a lot of Christians retaliating right now. It doesn't mean that you don't stand up for what you believe. And it doesn't mean that you don't seek justice. Yes, bad people should go to jail. They should be caught and go to jail. But God does have some strong words about revenge. And he basically says, that's my job. You leave that to me. So here we are in a situation where we have to say no to all these things. And so as I was thinking about it, I thought the way to learn how to say no is to say more yeses to God. The more we're saying yes to God, that'll be an automatic no to culture, to the enemy, to fear, retaliation, compromise, people pleasing. So we learn how to say a holy no, but we learn how to say a holy no by saying yes to the Lord. We're going to talk about some of these in a minute, but we've had prepare, which I hope you all still are preparing and thinking about how you're going to work on areas of your life to prepare how God might want to be preparing you in those different areas that we talked about in the first chapter of Daniel. We resolve, what decisions have you made about who you're going to be and what you're going to believe? And once you've prepared, as you prepare and as you resolve, then you know how to respond. So prepare and resolve are kind of the getting ready. Respond is where it hits the pavement and gets moving. Because Daniel had to resolve before he could respond. And we do too. So if we resolve that we are not going to retaliate, we resolve we are not going to compromise in these areas of our lives, then when that comes up, we know how to respond because we've already made the decision. So Graham, someone comes to you at work and says, hey, will you falsify this record because blah, 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 blah. If you have already resolved, I am not going to lie, then you can respond without compromise. I'm just trying to think of some other examples, but anyway, prepare, resolve, and then we can respond. And I encourage you to read through Daniel 1-6. These stories are just rich with these examples from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, and really see that Daniel set the tone for how things were going to go in so many areas of his life. And I'm looking at all of you on the screen, and you're all leaders. There are other people looking to you, whether at work or Graham, you've got work and you've got middle schoolers. You know, Jesse, you've got people under you in multiple places in church. Priscilla, Jacob, Jessica, every one of us has people that are watching how we do life, how we live out our faith. So how we, you know, maybe we're going to be the first person to say no to something that's going to help other people say no to it as well. So that being said, which one of these and I'm going to put some of these in the Discord, but I thought just as we're kind of finishing this up, which one of these no's do you think, oh, that's my hard one? That's the thing where I have a hard time with that one. Any one of those no's particularly stand out to you?
Well, Lord, I just, I come before you and I pray blessing and favor. I pray that the Lord that you would bless everybody, that you would keep them, that your favor would shine upon them, that you would bring them peace, and that they would always love you and know the power of no compromise, no retaliation, no to fear, and no to people pleasing. May they love you more at the end of each day than they did when they woke up. We bless your name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, have a good week. It's good to see you.